The Creator renamed. The deepest act of name erasure was not the personal name or the place name. It was the name of the Creator. Every indigenous people on Earth had a name for the divine before colonial contact. We have already spoken of Kaang among the San people, Olodumare among the Yoruba, Nyame among the Akan, Chukwu among the Igbo, Unkulunkulu among the Zulu, Wakantanka among the Lakota, Unetlanvi among the Cherokee. These were not primitive superstitions. These were sophisticated theological frameworks, developed and refined over thousands of years, transmitted through oral tradition, through ceremony, through story, through the daily practice of living in relationship with the created world and the Creator who made it. When colonial missionaries arrived, the theological message was consistent. The Creator you have been worshiping is either false or inferior. The true Creator is the one in this book. The true Creator has this name. The true Creator looks like this. In many cases, the local name for the divine was not simply dismissed. It was absorbed into the colonial framework and subordinated. The Akan word Nyame, meaning supreme being, was used by some missionaries to translate the Christian God, but in a context that erased the original Akan theology surrounding it and replaced it with European doctrine. The word survived, the meaning was replaced. In other cases, the local spiritual tradition was simply criminalized. Colonial governments across Africa and the Americas passed laws prohibiting indigenous religious practices, banning ceremonies, outlawing the speaking of certain languages in spiritual contexts. In the United States, the Indian Religious Crimes Code of 1883 made it a federal offense for Native Americans to practice traditional religious ceremonies. This law remained on the books until 1978, less than 50 years ago. You do not criminalize a spiritual practice unless you understand that it carries power. The colonial project understood exactly what it was suppressing. What survived? Here is what is remarkable. Despite everything, the name survived. Not perfectly, not completely, but in fragments, and family oral histories, and the work of anthropologists who documented traditions before they were fully suppressed, and the memories of elders who passed knowledge to grandchildren in secret. The name survived. The San people of southern Africa still speak of Kaang. The Yoruba diaspora across the Americas carried Olodumare into Brazil, into Cuba, into Trinidad, where the Orisha tradition maintained the names and the practices under the surface of colonial religion. The Lakota still call on Wakantanka. The Cherokee still know Unetlanvi. Griots, the oral historians and praise singers of West Africa, maintain their function across centuries of disruption. The griot tradition, documented across the Mande-speaking peoples of West Africa, including the Mandinka, Bambara, and Soninke, preserves genealogies, histories, and sacred knowledge going back hundreds of years through pure oral transmission. When Alex Haley traced his ancestry in writing Roots, it was a Gambian griot who confirmed the family connection by reciting an unbroken oral record that stretched back to the 18th century. The keepers did not let it die. The return to the original name. What we are doing at God's Black.Church is not about nostalgia. It is not about pretending that the last 500 years did not happen. It is about accuracy. When we use the name Kang, we are returning to the oldest documented name for the Creator in the oldest continuous human community on Earth. We are not inventing a new theology. We are recovering an ancient one. When we refuse to use the colonial image, the 1940 painting, the blue-eyed figure, the icon of empire, we are not rejecting spirituality. We are rejecting inaccuracy. We are saying, the creator of the first human family did not look like that and was not called that. Let us return to what is true. Every person listening to this, of every race and every background, had a name for the Creator before the colonizers arrived. Every culture carried a theology that was native to their land and their language. That knowledge is not gone. It is buried, and we are here to excavate it. You have a right to know your original name. You have a right to know the name your ancestors used for the Creator. You have a right to walk into your spiritual life, not through a door built by someone who enslaved your people, but through the door that was there before any of that happened. That door is still standing. It has always been standing. This is God's Black.Church. The name they took first, we are taking it back. Episode 4, The Real Face of Yeshua. God's Black.Church podcast, Discovery and History series. There is a painting that changed the world, not because it was great art, not because it captured something true, but because it was printed 500 million times and placed on the walls of churches, schools, homes, and institutions across every continent, and because it told a lie so confident, repeated so many times, distributed so completely, that billions of people accepted it as historical fact. The painting is the 1940 portrait by Warner Sallman, an American commercial artist from Chicago. It shows a light-skinned man with long brown hair, blue or green eyes, Anglo-European facial features, and a gentle, serene expression. It is the image most people in the Western world picture when they hear the name Jesus. It has no historical basis whatsoever. Welcome to God's Black.Church. Today we look at what the actual historical evidence tells us about who Yeshua of Nazareth actually was. Not the icon, not the painting, not the figure that was built to serve an empire. The man, the historical human being who walked in first century Roman-occupied Judea. The truth is more powerful than the image they sold the world. Who was Warner Sallman? Warner Sallman was born in Chicago in 1892. He was a commercial illustrator who worked primarily for Christian publishers and religious organizations. He was not a theologian. He was not a historian. He was not an archaeologist or a scholar of the ancient Near East. He was a commercial artist working in the tradition of European religious painting. In 1924, Sallman sketched a portrait of Jesus for a magazine cover. In 1940, he painted the full oil version that became known as the head of Christ. Within years, it was being reproduced by the hundreds of millions, printed on prayer cards, calendars, church bulletins, book covers, and eventually framed and hung in homes and sanctuaries across the world. Sallman's portrait was not based on any historical research. It was based on the European tradition of portraying Jesus, which itself had been building since the Byzantine era, a tradition that consistently depicted a Middle Eastern Jewish man in the physical likeness of European men. Fair skin, light eyes, soft features, the features of the culture doing the painting. Art historians have documented this pattern extensively. When Italian Renaissance painters depicted biblical figures, they painted them as Italians. When German painters depicted them, they painted them as Germans. The image evolved to reflect the dominant culture, not the historical subject. Sallman's 1940 portrait was simply the most commercially successful iteration of a tradition built entirely on projection. Dr. Joan Taylor and the historical evidence. In 2018, Dr. Joan Taylor, professor of Christian origins and Second Temple Judaism at King's College London, published a study examining the historical and archaeological evidence for what Yeshua of Nazareth would actually have looked like. Dr. Taylor's methodology was not spiritual, it was archaeological and forensic. She looked at skeletal remains from first-century Judea. She examined Roman-era art depicting people from the region. She analyzed written descriptions from the period. She applied everything known about the physical characteristics of Jewish populations in first-century Roman-occupied Judea. Her findings, published by the BBC and drawing on decades of academic research, were clear. The historical Yeshua almost certainly had dark brown skin, dark eyes, and short dark hair. His height would have been average for the period and region, approximately 5 feet 5 inches, the median for men of that time and place based on skeletal analysis. He would have looked, in Dr. Taylor's words, similar to other men from that part of the world at that time. He would have looked like a Palestinian Jewish man from the first century, because that is exactly what he was. There is nothing controversial about this conclusion in academic circles. Biblical scholars, archaeologists, and historians who work on the historical Jesus, as distinct from the theological figure, have understood this for generations. It is only outside of academic circles, in the popular imagination, and in the institutional church, that the image has been so resistant to correction. What first-century Judea actually looked like. To understand why the physical evidence points where it does, It helps to understand the geography and the populations of first-century Judea. The region that is now Israel and Palestine sits at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Over thousands of years, populations from all three continents passed through, settled and intermingled in this land. The Canaanites, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all left genetic and cultural traces in the population of the region. First-century Jewish populations in Judea were phenotypically diverse, as any population with that kind of complex ancestral history would be. But the central population, the working-class people of the Galilee region where Yeshua grew up, were predominantly dark-complexioned Semitic people. The Galilee was considered a rural, working-class, somewhat marginalized region even within Judea. It was not cosmopolitan. It was agricultural. Yeshua's background, as documented across multiple historical sources, was that of a craftsman or laborer from a small village. When Roman soldiers needed to identify Yeshua in the Garden of Gethsemane, according to the accounts, they needed Judas to point him out, because he looked like the other men around him. He was not visually distinct. He did not stand out in a crowd of first-century Galilean Jewish men. That detail alone is historically significant. A man with blonde hair and blue eyes in first-century Judea would have been immediately and visually distinct. He would not have required identification by a companion. The construction of the colonial Christ. Here is the question that matters. If the historical evidence is clear, if scholars have known for generations that the 1940 portrait is historically inaccurate, why does it persist? The answer is that the image was never really about history. It was about power. The formal theology of European Christianity developed alongside the expansion of European empires. The Roman Catholic Church and later Protestant denominations were not separate from colonization. They were its ideological infrastructure. The image of Christ evolved to serve a specific purpose: to make the divine look like the colonizer. A colonizer bringing Christianity to an African village could not effectively present a God who looked African. A colonizer bringing Christianity to an indigenous American community could not effectively present a God who looked indigenous. The entire project required a God who looked European. Because a European-looking God subtly communicated a European-looking divine order, one in which the European was at the top. This was articulated explicitly by colonizers who wrote about their methods. It was articulated in the educational curricula of colonial mission schools, which replaced indigenous images and stories with European ones. It was articulated in the laws that criminalized indigenous spiritual practices while mandating attendance at Christian churches. The image of a white Christ was not a mistake. It was a tool. Yeshua and the African connection. What gets buried even deeper than the physical appearance of Yeshua is his connection to Africa. According to the gospel accounts, which despite their theological purposes do contain historical details that scholars cross-reference with other sources, Yeshua was taken to Egypt as an infant to escape political violence. Africa was his refuge. The African continent protected the man whose image would later be used to justify the colonization of Africa. The North African theological tradition was central to the development of early Christianity in ways that are almost never taught in standard church education. Augustine of Hippo, whose theological writings are foundational to both Catholic and Protestant Christianity, was North African. Origen, one of the most influential early Christian theologians, was from Alexandria in Egypt. Tertullian, who gave Latin Christianity much of its theological vocabulary, was from Carthage in North Africa. The intellectual foundations of Christianity were built substantially in Africa, by African thinkers, in African cities. That history has been systematically obscured by the same colonial project that replaced the historical Yeshua with an Anglo-European icon. What we do with this? At God's Black.Church, we make a clear distinction that we need to speak plainly about. The man Yeshua of Nazareth was a real historical person. The figure called Christ in the colonial Christian tradition is a construct, an image built over centuries to serve specific political purposes. These are not the same thing. We do not need to litigate the theological claims about Yeshua's spiritual identity. What we can say with confidence, drawing on historical and archaeological evidence, is this: the man was not white. The image that was distributed to 500 million households was not historically accurate, and the institutions that built and spread that image had clear political motivations for doing so. Every person who grew up in a church with that painting on the wall was lied to, not necessarily by parents or pastors who knew the truth and chose deception. Most of them were told the same lie and passed it on in good faith. The lie was built into the architecture of the institution. Understanding that is not an attack on faith. It is a defense of truth, and truth is the only foundation on which anything real can be built. The historical Yeshua was a dark-skinned Jewish man from a working-class village in a colonized region who preached to the poor, challenged institutional power, and was executed by the state. That person is far more powerful and far more relevant to the lives of colonized and oppressed people than the blue-eyed icon on the wall. The real face of Yeshua looks like the people colonization tried to destroy. This is God's Black.Church. We trade the painting for the truth. Episode 5. The Ones Who Remembered. God's Black.Church podcast, Discovery and History series. They burned the libraries. They outlawed the ceremonies. They criminalized the languages. They separated the elders from the children. They replaced the names and the images and the stories. They built an entire global system designed to make indigenous knowledge disappear. And still, some people remembered. This episode is about them. Welcome to God's Black.Church. Today we honor the keepers, the men and women, the communities and traditions who held the original knowledge across generations of suppression and refused to let it die. Without them, the recovery we are attempting here would not be possible. Without them, the thread back to the first human family would have been completely severed. It was not, because of them. The griot tradition. Across the vast landscape of West Africa, from Senegal to Mali to Guinea to the Gambia, there exists one of the most extraordinary knowledge preservation systems in human history, the griot. The word griot is French, itself a colonial imposition on a tradition that predates French presence in the region by centuries. In Mande languages, the term is jali or jelly. In Wolof, it is gewo. But the function is consistent across cultures. The griot is a living archive. Griots are hereditary oral historians, praise singers, genealogists, musicians, and diplomats. They are trained from childhood to memorize the histories of families, clans, kingdoms, and peoples going back hundreds of years. A griot serving a noble family would know that family's lineage, their significant battles, their treaties, their marriages, their spiritual commitments, all of it held in memory and transmitted voice to voice across generations. When the Mandinka kingdom of Sundiata Keita was documented in the Epic of Sundiata, the 13th century founding story of the Mali Empire, it was preserved not in writing but in the memory of griots. The epic survived colonization, survived the Atlantic slave trade, survived the disruption of every political structure that had sustained it, because there were griots who kept it alive. Alex Haley, when researching his family history for roots, traveled to the Gambia in the early 1970s. He was taken to the village of Jufere, where a griot named Keba Kanga Fofana recited the oral history of the Kinte family going back to the 18th century, including the name of a young man named Kunta Kinte, who had been taken by slave traders. The griot's record matched the written records Haley had found in American archives, an unbroken oral chain maintained across more than 200 years through one of the most catastrophic disruptions in human history. That is what remembering looks like. The voodoo tradition and the survival of African theology. When enslaved Africans were transported to Haiti, then the French colony of Saint-Domingue, they came from multiple West and Central African cultures, Fon, Iwe, Yoruba, Congo, and others. They brought with them different names for the divine, different ceremonial traditions, different ways of understanding the spirit world. Under French colonial rule, the practice of African religion was illegal. Enslaved people were required to convert to Catholicism. The penalty for practicing African spiritual traditions ranged from torture to death. What happened next is one of the most remarkable acts of cultural survival in recorded history. The enslaved Africans of Saint-Domingue developed Vodou, a spiritual tradition that on the surface incorporated Catholic saints and Catholic imagery, but underneath preserved the names, the characteristics, and the spiritual functions of West and Central African divine figures called the Loa. Ogo, the fawn and Yoruba spirit of iron, war, and justice, was mapped onto St. James. Ezili Danto, the fierce protective mother spirit, was mapped onto the Black Madonna. Legba, the fawn and Ewe spirit of crossroads and communication, was mapped onto St. Peter. The Catholic imagery was a mask. The African theology survived inside it. This was not deception for its own sake. It was survival. It was the genius of a people who understood that the knowledge was more important than the form it wore. They gave the colonizer the form, they kept the substance. And when the Haitian Revolution came in 1791, the only successful slave revolt in the history of the Atlantic world, producing the only nation founded by formerly enslaved people, it began at a Vodou ceremony. The ceremony at Bois Caïman, conducted on August 14, 1791, is documented by multiple historical sources as the gathering at which the decision to revolt was made and the spiritual commitment was sealed. African theology, preserved through a century of colonial suppression, produced the most radical act of political liberation in the 18th century. The keepers of the Andean tradition. On the other side of the Atlantic, in the highlands of what is now Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the Quechua and Aymara peoples faced their own version of the erasure. When Spanish colonizers arrived in the Andes in the 16th century, they encountered the Inca Empire, the largest empire in pre-Columbian American history, stretching more than 4,000 kilometers along the Pacific coast. The Inca had sophisticated agricultural systems, road networks, architectural achievements including Machu Picchu, and a complex knowledge system transmitted through knotted string records called quipus. The Spanish systematically destroyed the Inca administrative and spiritual infrastructure. They demolished temples and built churches on their foundations, a deliberate act of spiritual displacement. They killed the priests and administrators who held the specialized knowledge to interpret quipus. They forced conversion to Catholicism. But the communities in the high mountain villages, the Ailu, the extended family-based community structures that formed the foundation of Andean social organization, maintained their practices. The Apus, the mountain spirits, continued to be honored. The Pachamama, the Earth Mother, continued to receive offerings. The agricultural ceremonies tied to the Inca calendar continued in forms that survived through being folded into Catholic feast days. Today, in communities across the Andean highlands, there are Pacos, Andean spiritual practitioners, who maintain knowledge traditions that trace back to pre-colonial times. Their practices were documented by anthropologists throughout the 20th century. They survived 500 years of colonial religious suppression. The Aboriginal Knowledge Keepers of Australia. Australian Aboriginal cultures represent some of the oldest continuous traditions on Earth, with archaeological evidence suggesting human habitation on the continent for at least 65,000 years. Aboriginal knowledge systems are sophisticated, complex, and deliberately designed for long-term transmission. The song lines, also called dreaming tracks, are networks of routes across the Australian landscape that encode geographic, historical, astronomical, and spiritual information in the form of song. A person who knows the relevant songs can navigate thousands of kilometers of terrain using the encoded information in the lyrics. Ethnomusicologist Stephen Mithin and researchers at the University of New South Wales have documented how Aboriginal oral traditions contain accurate descriptions of geological and astronomical events that occurred thousands of years ago, including the flooding of coastal areas at the end of the last ice age, approximately 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. The oral tradition preserved accurate geographic memory across more than 300 generations. British colonization of Australia, beginning in 1788, attempted to systematically destroy this knowledge tradition. Aboriginal children were removed from their families and communities in the Stolen Generations policy, which continued officially until the 1970s, and placed in institutions where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their cultural traditions. The explicit goal, stated in the language of colonial administrators, was to break the transmission chain. Despite this, Aboriginal elders maintained the knowledge. In remote communities and through underground transmission in communities closer to colonial centers, the songlines survived. The dreaming traditions survived. The knowledge of country, the intimate, multi-generational understanding of the land that could only have been built across tens of thousands of years of living in relationship with it, survived. Today, Aboriginal land management practices, particularly the use of controlled burning to maintain ecological health, are being formally recognized by Australian scientists and environmental managers as containing sophisticated ecological knowledge developed over millennia. They knew. They kept knowing. They kept it until the world was ready to listen. The common thread. What connects the griot of the Gambia, the voodoo priestess of Haiti, the Paco of the Andes, and the Aboriginal elder of Australia? They all understood that knowledge is a living thing. It does not survive in buildings because buildings can be burned. It does not survive in books alone because books can be destroyed and languages can be made illegal. It survives in people, in the decision of a grandmother to whisper the old names to a grandchild in the dark, in the decision of a community to maintain a practice that the colonial government has made dangerous, in the discipline of a young person who chooses to learn what their elders carry instead of only learning what the colonial school is willing to teach. Remembering was resistance. In every case, maintaining the old knowledge was an act of defiance against the system that required people to forget. And because they remembered, we can recover.